I'm once again so very excited to be at an Outlier podcast festival, even if it has to be a digital version. I'm excited to be here. And I hope, it's not reversed. It's not mirrored.
Boom.
Didn't work.
Love it. Great shirt. We're giving away a few shirts here, by the way, too. And that's a perfect example of what you're going to get.
I need to get it where it says Hull on the back and like my number or something. Like we've got our own virtual or remote distributed Outlier softball team or something.
Let's do it. It'll be right next to the Joe Test shirts.
Joe Test. Yeah, not to be confused with John Tesh.
That's right.
Right? Bad one. That's a dad joke.
Oh, yeah, that is a dad joke. So Brandon, we've known each other for a little while now.
Yes.
You've spoken at this is our third event. You and Jenna and a couple others have done our festival 3 times, and obviously we wouldn't invite you back if you didn't provide the value that you can and that you do every single time. And this is no different. The only thing that's different, obviously, a virtual stage, and this time truly a global audience. We have people from Ireland, South Africa, all over the UK. Right? It's going to be a lot of fun. So I'm going to give you the stage now. It's up to you. Let's do this. Thank you for being here.
Awesome. All right. Well, I am excited to be here. I revel in the opportunities to be in the same place at the same time as Ever Gonzalez. Absolutely 100%. And it doesn't happen often enough because now he's all over the place. But I'm excited to be a part of this, and especially to kind of close out the night, I guess, right? People are going to dinner here soon or already have eaten and now coming back, I guess, for the last session. So I'm glad to be a part of this. So we're talking in my session. So in the past sessions at Outlier, I've talked about interviewing, interview skills, ways to get your guests to open up and do more with your show via an interview. And Ever and I were talking about ways that we could maybe bring something a little bit different to the table for this Outlier. And I've had my own personal experience through my podcast and through others that I listen to or play a part in podcasts that have pivoted, that have changed or had to make a change, chosen to make a change for some reason. And it's made me really curious about how podcasts have gone about the process of changing. And so I've got some, not just my experiences, but some other wisdom that I'm hoping maybe I can pass along to others who are thinking about maybe their podcast is just not clicking for some reason. And they want to make a change, but they're not sure how to go about it. The timing is right, all of that. So that's what we're going to talk about today. So let me share my screen. I have a few slides and a few examples that I'll share. Let's go to, I've got a PowerPoint slide deck. Is that okay? I mean, can we do PowerPoint slide decks that are, 150 slides or something like that? Is that allowed? Ever? Is that rebellious enough? I'm kidding. All right. So pivoting your podcast. Doing it to better serve your audience, but also sometimes to better serve yourself. That's what I'm going to be talking about here. And you might be wondering what precipitated some of this. Why am I talking about this? I mentioned the conversation I had with Ever, but I lived this myself, and it really made me start thinking about maybe sometimes podcasters overthink. Maybe sometimes they underthink whether they should make small or dramatic changes to their podcast, either for their sanity purposes or because all of the signs say that they should make a change. So that's what I'm gonna share. Ever mentioned my podcast. Freelance to Founder is a podcast that I hosted for about 2.5, 3 years, and I actually just stopped hosting it at the turn of 2019 to 2020, which is yet another pivot that happened. And we went through a major pivot with my podcast that I'm going to share some experiences from. I'll share with you why we chose to make the pivot we did. And then I'm going to give some examples of just a handful of other podcasts that I'm aware of that have pivoted, a couple of which you'll probably be familiar with or maybe have heard of. And then a couple others I'm certain that you haven't heard of, but maybe share some stories about the why they pivoted, what they pivoted and changed about their podcast. And in one occasion, I've got some very specific details to share on what was the outcome of that pivot from a stats downloads standpoint. So that's what I'll cover. But it starts with my podcast, Freelance to Founder. Some of the other podcasts that one of which you may be familiar with, or a couple on the screen you may be familiar with. And like I said, one or two you're probably not familiar with at all, that have had their own either short-term or indefinite or permanent pivots, maybe a pivot in the podcast itself or a pivot from the podcaster, if you know what I mean with one of these podcasts. So I'm going to get into some of these examples, and I'm going to actually share some audio on a couple of these as well to talk about not just the how-to of it, but some examples of how things might be different. But the first question, so I've broken it down into really three sections. There's the why pivot, there's the when to pivot, and then there's the what you should pivot. And when I say pivot, I mean it's changing something about your podcast in enough of a way that it should be noticeable to your audience, definitely noticeable to yourself, in one of a variety of ways. Sometimes they might be very small reasons that you pivoted. Sometimes it'd be maybe a massive overhaul. But the first one we're going to talk about is, why should you consider making a change? Why should you consider pivoting with your podcast to begin with? And the first reason might be that, like, all the signs are there that you need to make a change. Everything is screaming at you, like you can't stop thinking about your podcast needing to change. That might be the first indicator that change needs to be in the air if you hadn't been thinking about it for the longest time. You were sure you wanted to interview a certain type of author, or you were sure you wanted to have your buddies gather around every Sunday night to talk about the NFL games that day, or you were sure you wanted to have a podcast about a certain subject, and you are a subject matter in that subject, but something is gnawing at you and you feel like you've got to make a change. I'll get into some maybe reasons that are good reasons why you might want to pivot, as well as bad ones, but you feel it. Like your gut is telling you, I need to make a change. Some good reasons might be the ones I'm listing on the screen here. Maybe you're just getting bored with your podcast. Maybe you're getting consistent feedback from your ratings, reviews, or the emails that come to you from your listeners that give you a lot of nudges or suggestions about things they'd like to hear from your podcast. Maybe there's a chance to engage your audience, your listeners, in a whole different way than you currently are. Maybe all of you just think alike a little too much, and now it's time to stir the pot a little and throw a wrench into things and challenge your own neighborhood of listeners whom you're like in a lot of ways, philosophically or lifestyle wise or whatever, but it's time to make a little bit of a change and engage them or challenge them in a new way. That's a good reason to make a change to your podcast. Maybe your download numbers are just slowly dropping in the face of maybe the next item on the list, which is competition. Or maybe they're just dropping because you haven't structured your podcast in a way that engages people from beginning to end, and people are just kind of tuning out. That might be a good reason to pivot your podcast. Competition. Rob Greenlee published an article just this past week talking about us passing the 1 million mark in podcast and the worry about the number of podcasts created outpacing the number of podcast listeners, or at least the growth rates of those two things. And you might feel like you have a somewhat niche subject that you're talking about, but it's not really hyper niche, or you don't bring something new to that niche. And as a result, you've got all kinds of competition of shows. And normally I don't think of it in terms of competition personally. I think of it as it's another style of show. It's another variety or flavor of show in a category. But maybe that is stealing away listeners from your podcast. And then ROI. When I say ROI, I actually don't necessarily mean the cost from a financial standpoint and what you put into your podcast and what you get out of it. I'm actually talking about the return on the invested time you put into it. This was a huge reason why my podcast pivoted, and we'll get into that in just a minute here. But you might just be putting so much into your podcast and getting so little out of it that you've got to make a change. And an ROI is a really good reason. But what are some bad reasons why people should, or why people sometimes think they need to pivot? And you need to rethink those reasons. Maybe you need to stick to what you're doing with your podcast. Just because you got one bad review doesn't necessarily mean anything. When you get one bad piece of feedback, that doesn't necessarily mean anything. You shouldn't panic just because you feel like you should make a change. It should prompt you to consider ways you could change and evolve your show or adapt your show or take your show to the next level. But panic just because of one really bad review, that's not a good reason to overhaul a show. So those are some reasons why you might pivot. What about why or the when you should pivot? When should you do this? I pivoted my show about 90. We did about 90 episodes before I left that show at the end of 2019. But that show, we had published around 60 or so episodes, 50 to 60 episodes, and I felt a weight on me in producing that show. It was a chore to produce the podcast. I loved the idea of being on a microphone and talking to smart people, one-time freelancers or one-time solo contributors that have a certain talent, and turn it into a business and it grows. Just selfishly, I liked the idea of talking to people like that. But the idea of producing a show the way I did was taxing. I didn't enjoy it a whole lot. And for me, I was close to getting out of podcasting entirely, solely for that reason. I was burned out. And I'm not the only one that has experienced that before. So when should you pivot? Should you wait 50 episodes? Is there a magic number? I waited 50 episodes. I've got an example of a podcast that didn't change anything about their format for 700 episodes over 6 years. And then finally, COVID-19 served as sort of a wonderful prompt for them. I don't say wonderful, but served as I don't know, almost like a glaring neon sign saying to them, hey, change things up. Serve your audience in a different way. And the results of doing that were pretty extraordinary for this podcaster that I'll talk about in a minute. But so it was 700 episodes for them. Then I've got another example that I'll talk about here in a minute of a podcast that was only a handful of episodes in. And they stopped what they were doing after a handful of episodes and said, we're not going about this the right way. We're not talking about, they were a video game podcast. They felt like they just weren't serving their audience in the best way in terms of how they were presenting these games, how they were recapping their experience with playing some of these video games. And it was only a handful of episodes. They decided, you know what, we're making a change. So there's no magic number on that. The real issue is you need to be critiquing your own show at all times to spur creative thinking. You might have all kinds of ideas. Keep a little log of ideas of ways that you can improve your show at all times. And you might find that there are micro pivots that can happen throughout. So the reality is, because this is the Outlier Podcast Festival, we should be talking about rebellious attitudes with podcasting. The truth is, you can podcast whenever you want. You can podcast after episode 1. You can podcast after episode 50. You can do it after episode number 500. Do it whenever you want. But when you do it, do your research before you simply go in a new direction. Talk to your audience as well. Get insight from them if you have a way to communicate with your audience, and you may find amazing things result from that. So there's not a magic, in my opinion, there's not a magic number in terms of episodes of when you should change your podcast. If your downloads are flat after doing 50 episodes, from episode 35 through episode 50, your downloads are flat, who cares? If you enjoy making the show, it's not a stressor for you, who cares? Maybe you don't need to change the podcast at all if everything about it is fun. If you're wanting to accomplish more with your podcast, though, that's a different story. If you're wanting your podcast to serve as an important source of income for you, for example, well, yeah, you might need to make a change, even though you enjoy the format, or you love the name of your podcast, or you love the type of guest that you bring on. There might be another reason to make a change. Talking to your audience and doing your research of other podcasts in your category, maybe even challenging yourself and looking at podcasts in other categories where you can gain some inspiration from as far as the format or something like that, the way they go about building their show and engaging their audience and marketing their show. That might serve as another way, another good indicator of when it's a good time to change your podcast. And what should you pivot about your podcast? This is a huge one. There's so many things that you could change about your podcast. If you Google the search term podcast formats, this is now, I don't want to say it's a popular subject necessarily, like everybody is suddenly this week or month or year publishing articles about it. But over the last year, so I'm talking about what to pivot. What about your podcast should you pivot? Before you go making dramatic changes to your show, I'm a huge believer in doing a little bit of homework first. Do a little bit of research, like be an actual student of podcasting. Don't just want to be a podcaster. You may not have to treat it like an industry or something like that. And for many of us, this isn't our full-time thing. It's something we enjoy either listening to or participating in after hours, weekends, whatever. But be a student. If you're going to be on a microphone, you're going to want a show that people are going to want to listen to over time, and you want it to be a good show. Be a student of the art of it. Don't just be a doer of podcasting. So I've got an example of a great article that's a good source for beginning to drill down into some data that talks a little bit about the top podcast charts and what we can learn from them. This article isn't necessarily new, but Pacific Content does a good job of sort of rehashing what we can learn from the charts, not just publishing updated charts, if that makes sense. So this is a great place to start to get an idea of what's going on in your category. You can obviously also just pull up a podcast player, go to your category, and start scrolling through the podcast to see what's out there. So when we talk about what to pivot, there's any number of items that you can pivot. Before you even go there, though, you really should take a look at what's out there. Because if you're looking at the screen now, there's all kinds of things that could either be a minor tweak or a huge overhaul as part of your show. The name of it, the image for your podcast, the frequency with which you publish an episode, your approach to the podcast. And I'll explain that in a little bit more detail here in a minute. The format of the podcast, whether it's an interview show, it's solo hosted by you, that sort of thing. And I've got some examples on the right-hand side of that. The episode length, which I'll get to as an example here in a minute. Episode segments. Maybe your podcast is literally an hour and 10 minutes of just you talking or just you interviewing somebody. And a tweak or a pivot of your podcast could be introducing segments. Your first 5 minutes, you cover the news in your industry or something else. The next 15 minutes are your interview. The following 15 minutes are you sharing some takeaways from that interview. And then you have a final 15 minutes or something that is a glimpse into future episodes and challenging your audience to do something, take some action, or to have some specific takeaway from the podcast that you want them to report back on or something along those lines. Getting listeners involved might be the way that you overhaul or pivot your podcast. Maybe it's you talking a lot or your panel talking a lot on your podcast, but you never really get your listeners involved. There's some podcasts that have gone from being just great interview shows to now having occasional episodes that involve questions from their listeners. And none of us may be unfamiliar with those types of shows, but you've never done it. And there's a great opportunity there to kind of make your listeners part of your show. Doing a podcast, doing your show maybe via live stream, via YouTube, or including a YouTube element and not just an audio part of your podcast would be an interesting pivot. I've given examples of different types of formats on the right-hand side. Obviously, there's numerous formats you can do, even narrative podcasts, which is what I used to do before switching to a pure interview show. But you may have a solo. If you've always just had a hosted show, just a single hosted show, you may switch from a solo show to having a recurring host, you and one other person on a regular basis. Maybe if you're in that situation right now, you switch to having you as the host and a recurring host instead to having a rotating host where you have a different person joining you at some point in the show, or every episode is a different co-host. Or maybe instead of having just one co-host, you have a panel, or you have occasional episodes where instead of you and your traditional co-host, you have a panel of people on the show. There's all kinds of different ways that you can do this. Maybe you need to change or be more specific about who your target listener is to your podcast. Maybe you've always been too vague about who you want to listen to your show. I want to be people like this, but also people like this, people like this, and people like this. And maybe you need to refine and treat your show as though you're talking to one specific person sitting across the table from them. Maybe that would change a lot about how your podcast feels from a listener perspective. Maybe you need to switch your commitment. I've read so many podcasters who get burned out, like I was at one point in time, with the production of my show, and they want to throw in the towel, when really what they could do to give themselves a break is just switch from, say, a weekly format to a seasonal format. Or maybe if that seasonal format doesn't let them get into enough of a groove, they do just the opposite. They go from publishing 8 episode seasons to doing an ongoing every week podcast, which is what I did with my show some time back. So there's all kinds of different things that you can do that represent micro pivots about your show. But you could, of course, scrap it all and just go bonkers and make a huge change to your show. But before you commit to one or many of these, I believe it's important to think about this factor. Is this going to be a temporary change to your show, or is it going to be an indefinite one where I'm literally going down this road now? This is who I'm going to speak to in my podcast. This is our new cover art. This is the new format of a show, all of that sort of thing. And we're going to run with it for the next 6 months, and we're going to see what the stats tell us. And we're going to see how listeners respond. We're going to see if my audience likes this kind of show versus the kind of show I was given to them a little bit before. So if you commit, just know that you might have to be a little bit patient about whether that paid off, whether that changing or overhauling pivoting your show actually paid off for you or not. You have to be a little bit patient with the fact that your audience is now having to get used to a whole new show that you changed maybe without consulting them. And now all of a sudden they've got to figure out if they like this show. They might like you as a host, but the show just is hard for them to get into now because of the way you change it. So, but again, you may not need to overhaul at all. It may be just a small change that you need to make your show feel different for you and to give it a little bit different flavor for your audience. So let's talk about some specific pivot examples. I told you I was going to lead with my show in particular. I'm going to tell you why I pivoted my show and what I pivoted about my show a long time ago before ultimately leaving my show at the end of the year last year. ROI, I mentioned that. So Freelance to Founder started off as a narrative nonfiction show. It would feature the story of a one-time freelancer who became a founder of a company that grew beyond themselves, and an interview. I would conduct an interview with that founder. That interview might last an hour and 15 minutes, hour and a half, something like that. And then I would turn that hour and a half interview into a narrative story about that founder, taking us from their younger years through the modern day and not all, but many of the decisions they made along the way to get where they are today. Honestly, it was a massive endeavor to build a show like that. And so a typical episode was 20 minutes, 22 to 30 minutes in length, the finished episode. And it took me anywhere between 8 to 10 hours to produce that episode. The research beyond landing the guests, it was the research of the guest, it was the preparing of the questions, it was the actual interview conducted, it was the building of the story and the script that would go along with that, it was recording my narration, it was adding the music, production, handing it off from there. And I list boredom as a reason why I want to pivot it. I don't know if maybe boredom is quite the right word, but I felt hemmed in. I felt like I was running a podcast that was a machine, and it was hard to produce, took a lot of hours to produce a 23-minute show or a 33-minute show in that span. On top of that, competition was stiff in the world of founder-based podcasts. There are so many podcasts that talk to entrepreneurs and how unique and different they all are from all the rest of us. And I say that somewhat tongue-in-cheek, but the point is that there was a lot of shows that talked about that, and I felt like there was a lot of competition there. And honestly, while my show was unique because of its narrative approach, it was also challenging because it was literally just me, as though I'm a Dateline NBC narrator telling someone else's story, and there just wasn't a lot of personality to it, honestly. So we had to make a change. What did we pivot? We pivoted the format. It went from narrative story show to full-on interview show. The length of the show went from 25 to 30 minutes in that range to an hour show, full hour show. We introduced later on, after launching the show, segments. where we would talk about one specific thing for the first third, another thing for the second third, and then I would always have a segment that I like to end with them, which is their one answer to 3 specific questions. And then eventually the host changed. I left the show, and the show relaunched with my former co-producer, Preston Lee, relaunched just recently with a little bit more of a 2-hosted show, sort of different format altogether. So almost like a second pivot. So I thought I'd give a couple examples. Let me share my browser here, and I'll give you a feel for how this show was before. So as luck would have it, if you are in this up to speed on all the memes going on in the world right now, there's a certain comedian, an author named Sarah Cooper, has been very popular recently for some parodies of Donald Trump that she's done and his press conferences. Well, she was on my show 3 years ago when she had just recently left her jobs at Google, Yahoo in the past, and had written a book, 100 Ideas to Look Smart in Meetings. Very funny book. And this turned it, she dabbled in it. She wrote the book while she was a full-time employee, and this turned into her being able to turn it into a full-time thing. And this is what the show was like before.
I had been sitting kind of on this idea for many years, and when I first came up with the first few tricks,
I'd give a little excerpt from my guest,
and I'd written them in a notebook, and then forgot about it and came across it again 7 years.
Well, Sarah Cooper wrote a full book on the subject. The hilarious.
And this is me giving my overview of what you're going to hear on the show and a little intro to the guest.
October 2016. A full year later, in the crowded category of business and professional good is the book.
Scale, leadership at scale, engineering at scale.
So this was me
at scale,
playing an excerpt from one of her YouTube videos that was very funny.
Let me ask you guys, what would you?
I had to go grab that audio, grab that, pull that into the show.
Within hours.
And then I begin to tell the story of
Sarah.
Was an
interface designer.
We're now 2 minutes into the show, maybe more,
and
you haven't even heard from Sarah yet. You heard a snippet, but you haven't heard from Sarah, and she's unbelievably funny, extremely talented, has an amazing story.
Theater and
but I would talk about her story, play an excerpt, and then talk about her story, play an excerpt, talk about her story, and so forth. And the work that was involved in this,
digital design through that, and
her story is awesome. The work that went into producing that show was tremendous. It's so much time and effort, and the end result was a 30-minute show where I didn't feel like my guest was featured nearly enough, and the episode was all about them. So after doing about 60 episodes like this and talking to some amazing entrepreneurs, I pivoted. I made a proposal to my co-producer Preston that we make a change, and literally on a dime, we still published in seasons for a while, but we made a change to publish a show that's much more of a traditional interview show, but followed a similar format.
I'm Brandon Hull, and this is Freelance to Founder.
So this is me talking to the 2 founders of Bear Watches.
Goods business, anything, selling goods to consumers. So
what was important to me when I pivoted my show was that we didn't go from one format to another, and it feels like literally an entirely different show. I still wanted it to have a similar feel to them.
In under 2 years with very little experience. Welcome to Freelance to Founder, where I uncover the stories of freelancers and solopreneurs to start their own thing, and even how they launched a Kickstarter.
Same basic concept.
Can cook and write.
The point here is that as this episode gets underway, I still have the same music. I still have an excerpt from my interview. I still introduce my guests and talk about why this show is going to be important to my listeners. But then after I get past the sponsors and all of that sort of thing, the show is me as a personality, so to speak, welcoming my guest or guests onto the show, and us just having a little bit more of a structured but still flexible conversation. And sometimes they would be 53 minutes, sometimes they'd be an hour and 11 minutes. They weren't that structured where it was painful and you felt hemmed in as a podcaster, but they had the same sort of story arc that they followed. But it was a much more loose conversation that featured the guest in a whole new way. And it changed everything for me in running that podcast for another 30 or so episodes before stepping down. Huge lift in numbers. When I stepped away, we were just under 500,000 downloads across those 90 episodes, and the average number of listens in the first week of an episode was far greater than it was in our earlier days. Part of that could be, of course, to momentum over time, but part of that, I'm convinced, was a result of my guests feeling more comfortable sharing their episodes, but also the show itself being much more of a proven format, a show style that people were used to, and it wasn't so unique that it alienated a lot of people like I felt like the narrative show did. So that's my show. And the change was permanent or indefinite, I guess you could say, with my podcast. But I have another podcast to share with you that is a little bit different story. So let me go back to Keynote for just a minute and share this one with you. This is Restaurant Unstoppable. My good friend, Eric Cacciatore, hosts this podcast, and it's his full-time job. It became his full-time job about 2.5 years ago. He has been hosting this show. He's up in, I think, in the 730, 750 episode level at this point. And his show today is just like his show was. His talent is much greater and his production quality is much greater. But the show format today is much the same as it was 500 episodes ago. But this spring, he made a short-term temporary pivot because of the audience that he serves. He's a passionate, local, small, independent restaurant guy, and he made a decision to pivot so that he could better serve his listeners, which are small, independent restaurant owners. There was a great opportunity, is what I'm getting at, is for as far as his reasons to pivot. He did not do it for financial reasons. He didn't do it to try to make, to change his sponsorship model, although that did change as well. That wasn't the purpose. He felt compelled to provide a insight or expertise to his listeners in a way that he was sure no other restaurant podcast would, and he felt like the times were unprecedented, especially for the restaurant industry, and he needed to do that. Oh, by the way, it was a great way for him to differentiate his podcast from any other podcast where restaurant people are being interviewed. He also did it in a way because he gets emails constantly from his listeners, and he felt like, reading between the lines in these emails, he was getting requests for content that would help people sort out what they should do as an independent restaurant owner in these times of coronavirus. So he changed everything for a short period of time, and the results were dramatic. He changed the format. He used to be an hour and 22-minute interview show, hour and 25, hour and a half, whatever, interview show. So for a 45-episode stretch, and he did those, I should back up, he did those episodes twice per week. A long time ago, he did 3 episodes per week. He switched it to 2 per week. But during this COVID-19 coronavirus period, he switched to a shorter format interview show, 20-minute episodes almost every single day. He would talk to a new restaurant owner about how they were navigating these unprecedented times. And sometimes the conversations were really difficult. Sometimes they were extremely tender. Sometimes they were extremely practical. But the length of the show changed. The topic of the show changed because there was a new context to everything. The frequency of the show changed because he was publishing so frequently. And he also changed the sponsorship model solely so he could demonstrate to his audience that he wanted to be there for them in a way that was about content first and not about revenue. And I'm about to show you what the numbers were. These are his actual Libsyn stats, with his permission. These are his actual Libsyn stats during COVID-19. Check those out. I know there's been a lot of talk here and there about what are your numbers during the coronavirus and so forth. And these kind of blow me away. They blow me away. Now, you could argue that, okay, well, it looks like April went down a little bit from March. Yeah, they did. But April were 4 times what his normal episodes were. And the numbers are awesome still for all of those months. Absolutely stunning and absolutely amazing. And it just goes to show that sometimes if you publish more content, individual episodes may drop in terms of their listenership, but your audience grows because the ways you're providing them or the amount of content, good content, you're giving them as opportunities to learn. Unbelievable numbers from Eric. So if you're curious about that, let's go back I'm going to share. Oh, and just in case that, I want to make sure you guys saw those numbers. Did you guys see those numbers? Was I not showing my screen? I might not have been showing my screen the proper way. I might have been still on my Chrome browser.
Still on the
if
other
I
one.
was,
We did not see the numbers.
What's that, Ever?
Yeah, we did not see the numbers. We see them now, though. Thanks.
I didn't switch over. These are his numbers. Unbelievable. Unbelievable. And they're still going strong for May as well. So will an audience listen during difficult times? Well, his did. I can't speak for everybody's niche, but his sure did really well. So let me give you kind of an example of how things changed with him. I'm going to go back to my browser and I'll talk to you about what he did. So this was, let's see, this is Eric's podcast. This is the first one he did in this new format.
The past 4 days have been a hurricane. Well, not technically, but what has been going on is also a natural disaster, and it's been taking our industry by storm. There's another pun. What do we do? I don't know. Honestly, there's so much that's been coming out the past 3 to 4 days, and whatever is the latest news is only relevant for a short period of time, and then there's a new announcement. I've been thinking about how I could create an episode around this, but I think that it's going to take far more than an episode. So late last night, I was laying in bed, and it kind of just like dawned on me that
I just love the transparency.
Start
Eric's phenomenal.
Doing short recordings, sharing the stories, mental state of mind, the lessons that have been learned from restaurant operators, leading restaurant operators throughout the nation, specifically around how to handle coronavirus. And
all right, so that's just to give you a snapshot of his introduction of this new format for his listeners. And he did this. This is Corona Chronicle #1. I'm pulling this up on Podchaser. He ended up doing, I think, just over 40 of these episodes. And it was during this very time, if you saw those charts again, that this is when the numbers ratcheted up. Did he produce a lot more content? You're darn right he did. You're talking about instead of 2 interviews every single week, he's got a very specific a context that he wants to address with each of those restaurant owners almost on a daily basis. Not quite, but 3 to 4 times, maybe even 5 times on some weeks during the next 2 months. And the numbers were amazing. The feedback was tremendous. It was absolutely practical. I try to put myself in the shoes of a restaurant owner listening to the show, and I was blown away, feeling like, man, if I owned a restaurant in some random suburban area in the US and wasn't sure what I should do next, like this is my playbook. This is my blueprint for doing that. Talk about a pivot of a show. It's a risky pivot for him. It put a lot of work on his plate. And then, frankly, it took a lot of money off his plate because he was a 6-figure podcaster and decided to set aside his traditional sponsorship model. And he addresses that actually in one of the episodes too. But he went from a typical CPM type of model to what he called a CPA. It was actually more of an affiliate type of model. And he just talked about a couple products he felt strongly in, but he did not go the traditional sponsorship route and did it proactively and did it to serve an audience. Absolutely amazing. And if you only look at the download numbers and his peace of mind and measure that as far as what he gave back to his audience and what they, how much more loyal and grateful they were for his content, that went through the roof. Amazing change by Eric with his podcast. So let's go back. We'll go back to another example. Let me go back to the keynote. There we go. Okay. Example number 3. This is a different kind of pivot. And this is not a single solo person podcast. Some of you may be familiar with a company called Basecamp, basecamp.com. It's a project management software. They published a really cool, also narrative podcast called The Distance, which featured blue collar, brick and mortar type of businesses in the Chicago area, I think surrounding area as well. The stories of those profitable businesses, they were awesome stories. I loved this podcast. About 84 episodes in, however, they made an abrupt change. Basecamp is an extremely opinionated company. The founders, David Heinemeier Hansen and Jason Fried, one of the key elements of how they brand themselves is not just telling people how great Basecamp is. In fact, just the opposite. It's really sharing their wisdom on building a business, a profitable business, and it really says no to all of the trends that you see with software companies getting funding and getting traction, but never really making any money profitably from a profit standpoint. And those opinions are a big part of their brand. So while I haven't talked to them personally about why they pivoted, they did sunset their show, The Distance. And in the final episodes of The Distance, they introduced their next podcast, which was called Rework, named after one of their popular books, Rework. But if you think about it, they went from a show that was extremely well done and very differentiated, though, to a show that, while it was a little bit more of a commodity because it's an interview show, kind of like what I did with my podcast pivoting, it was much more aligned with what their brand was. Their opinions are played out a little bit more. Now, they don't even really host the show. They've shown up a couple times as guests on their own podcast. They farm it out to a professional host who does a great job with it, but they changed the name from The Distance to Rework. Rework is aligned with what their book is. They changed the topic. Instead of just featuring stories of brick and mortar companies, now they talk about a little bit more modern topics that founders face and companies face. And they changed the frequency as well. So they're now dozens of episodes into the new podcast called Rework. It's a tremendous one. I won't have an example for you, but if you want to check out the two, you can see how different they are. In the first episode of Rework, they even talk transparently about why Rework exists as a podcast now. That's another good example. So let's get to yet another one. This is a podcast that I guarantee you haven't heard of. I heard about these guys making a change by interacting with them on Reddit. So Retrospectives, clever name, is a gaming podcast, and it's got two hosts. They talk about their experience in trying out new games. And these are games that they're not familiar with initially. They're games that they just pick out, download them to whatever, Xbox or their PlayStation or whatever, and they play the game, and then they do an episode talking about that game. They got some feedback from listeners and had this gut intuition that they were talking over the heads of listeners. They were using a lot of jargon from the games themselves, a lot of terminology that the game uses to describe the game. And if you weren't already familiar with the game, you were hoping to maybe learn about new games, there was too much insider talk. So between the feedback they got on their first few episodes and their gut feel themselves, they completely changed their approach to the show. Now the show has a much more polished feel to it. They've added some really neat music segments to it as well. And instead of just talking about a game, a video game that they played for the first time in a way that only they know because they were insiders, they now talk about the game experience from an outsider's perspective. And it's paying off for them. So how cool that they would be in tune. They probably had this idea for a podcast a long time, wanted to publish it, but sure enough, they pivoted at the last minute after launching it. After all this planning, they pivoted. Why? Because listeners are telling them, hey, they feel like they're not part of an inside joke or something like that. Cool way to make a pivot, even early on. Like I said, you don't have to be 80 episodes or 700 episodes in. And then how about this pivot? A Jordan Harbinger show. Jordan Harbinger was a podcast host, well known for the Art of Charm podcast and the program that goes along with it. Jordan had a falling out with his partners behind the Art of Charm. His why pivot was a little bit different from other people's in that he was summarily dismissed from the show that he was the host of. It was a crazy story. He now tells it pretty openly in a lot of places. I've spoken with him and interviewed him for a show as well. And he tells that story without holding anything back. But he also felt like he needed to do more with that podcast. There was like a mission he needed to fulfill. If you listen to the Jordan Harbinger show now, he will talk to extremely well-known people versus the people he knew now. The guest notoriety level ratcheted up several notches. The preparation he put into the show, it used to be they were talking about topics that were important as part of the Art of Charm context. Now he's talking about people who've been successful and kind of gets into their heads about what is it in their DNA or what is it about their preparation or their approach. He digs into things in an amazing way and asks questions that I think most interview hosts would not even think to ask. And he does it without having a lot of setup or a lot of a lot of apologies to get deep and right out of the gates with his podcast guests. So the format's different. The preparation he puts in is entirely different. The guest notoriety is on a whole new level. He had Kobe Bryant on, I think late last year as well, and Dennis Rodman. He's had noteworthy scientists, former government personnel, all kinds of amazing guests from all walks of life that he would have never had on Art of Charm. What caused the pivot was something that he was not prepared for, but he seized that moment and turned it into a show that is extraordinary from a production standpoint now. Not just the work he does, but also the work that Jason does behind the scenes as a producer for it. So these are a few examples of how people have changed their podcast. In the interest of time, let's recap and talk about some of the takeaways and maybe even go through some of those what to podcast in a little bit more methodical way, if you will. So takeaways. What I love about podcasting is it's not broadcasting. You write the rules for your podcast. You can talk about whatever you want to talk about. You can cater to a specific audience or cater to a wide audience. It's really up to you. You shouldn't have to feel hemmed in. Now, having said that, you should research. You should study the other podcasts in your category. And for sources of inspiration, maybe you should study podcasts in other categories as well. So that's an important part of this, is being a good, like I said earlier, being a good student of podcasts. But if you're ready to pivot for the right reasons, and respect that listeners like predictability. When I mentioned that I pivoted my podcast, our numbers jumped precipitously out of the gates with the new format. Maybe we marketed a little bit different, and I don't remember in hindsight. I don't think that we did, but I'm pretty confident that the numbers jumped noticeably right out of the gates with the new format. But we kept certain elements of the show exactly the same for that predictability piece. People like that continuity. They don't like things to completely change like a record scratch moment. They like familiarity. The more you can pivot and yet maybe keep some elements on board with your show for a little bit longer, the more comfortable people will feel in following you along on that transition. So respect that people like that change process. So we talked about some of the things that you could change. Name. There's a great article by the guys at Pacific Content. Here's a link down at the bottom for you to learn a little bit more about the art and science of naming your podcast, that you can see here. And if you shoot me a message, I'll give my contact details at the very end here in just a couple minutes. I'm happy to provide these links to you if you don't have time to jot them down. Great content piece on the art and science of naming your podcast. That's one thing that you might want to tweak. Cover images. Have you ever just gone through your favorite podcast playing app, like scrolled through it and looked at the podcast images like I'm doing in this image right now? Some of them are awesome, and you can kind of get a feel for whether maybe the podcast is interesting at a first glance. Others, they're impossible to read, or they're too clever, or they're too different, and you scroll right past them. You just don't even give them the time of day. So give some thought to maybe your cover image is you're getting a little too clever with it. Maybe it's too busy. Maybe the words are a little too small. We're not reading these cover images on a large desktop computer or laptop. We're seeing them in little podcast playing apps on our phone. So maybe your cover image, maybe just a little tweak like that will help with it. Frequency is a big thing. If you want to avoid burnout, be mindful of how frequent you're obligating yourself to publishing your podcast. Approach. How you approach your podcast. That Retrospectives podcast, I think, is a good example of how they changed their approach. They didn't change the format. They just changed their approach to how they talked about games on their show. The format, that's a big one, obviously, that you can make a massive change to. There's a lot of articles about podcast formats that I mentioned. This is a particularly good one that CastOS, I think that's how you pronounce it, Castos, published on the different types of formats you could consider for your show. I like to get inspiration from other categories that I don't have, that my podcast is not in, but this is a cool way just to learn about different podcasts. Episode segments, breaking your show up into different segments is a nice way also to change your show. I mentioned that. The good example of that was my friend at Restaurant Unstoppable, Eric Cacciatore. Not only changed how his show is formatted, but changed the length of that show, everything about it for that short period of time with those 40 or so episodes. Segments, listener involvement, and I won't go through all of these, but I do have one more example here. Jeb Blunt is a sales trainer who's got a podcast that, and a brand called Sales Gravy that he's put on for a long time. Jeb pivoted to videos just a couple of years ago. And some of his videos, when they're brand new, may only get 100 or 200 views in the first couple days. But as time goes by, it ratchets up into the hundreds and then into the thousands. It's a great way for him to add additional content or repurpose his podcast, like Jacqueline was talking about in the last segment. So that's another thing you might want to consider, is either adding video or pivoting to video. And then there's all the different types of formats that we talked about a little bit before. That's me, Brandon Hull, facebook.com/Brandon Hull, twitter.com/Brandon Hull. If you want to get in touch with me, BrandonHull@gmail is my email address. You can also reach me at brandon@subdivisions.fm. And I'm happy to answer any questions or provide any links for you if you want to do a little bit more research in pivoting your podcast. Ever, I guess I should turn it over to you. We got derailed a little bit with our audio, so hope I didn't go too long, but I'll put it back in your hands, friend.
No, you were great. Thank you so much. As always, you did not disappoint, even with the little interruption in the middle there. It was a great presentation, great session for sure.